The air in the room was heavy with the smell of antiseptic and the low, rhythmic hiss of the oxygen concentrator. It's a sound I still hear when the house gets too quiet. My grandfather, the man who had been my only real anchor in a world that always felt a little too shaky, was disappearing into the white sheets of his hospice bed. He looked smaller than I remembered, his skin like translucent parchment stretched over a frame that used to seem invincible. I sat there, squeezed into a plastic chair that groaned every time I shifted, holding his hand. His grip was weak, just a ghost of the strength he used to have when he'd teach me how to sand down cedar planks in his workshop. The silence inside the room was brittle, but outside the door, the world was loud and ugly. I could hear my parents through the thin wood of the hallway. They weren't crying. They weren't whispering in hushed, respectful tones. They were arguing. My father's voice, sharp and impatient, was vibrating with a kind of frantic greed that made my stomach turn. He was talking about the watch collection. Grandpa had 3 Omegas and a Patek Philippe that he had kept in a felt-lined box for 40 years. My mother was countering him, her voice a jagged edge, reminding him that the antique silver service and the mahogany sideboard were promised to her side of the family. It was sickening. Here was a man who had worked 50 years in the heat of a machine shop to provide for them, and they were already mentally tagging his belongings like they were at a Saturday morning garage sale. To them, he wasn't a father or a grandfather anymore. He was just a collection of assets waiting to be liquidated. They were vultures circling a man who was still drawing breath. Every time their voices rose, I felt a fresh wave of shame. I wanted to scream at them to shut up, to show some shred of dignity, but I couldn't bring myself to let go of Grandpa's hand. I looked back at him and realized his eyes were open. They were cloudy, but there was a sudden, sharp focus in them that I hadn't seen in days. He had heard them. A small, bitter smile twitched at the corner of his mouth, a look of profound disappointment that broke my heart. He beckoned me closer, his breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches. I leaned in until my ear was inches from his lips, the stubble on his cheek scratching my skin. He didn't waste time on platitudes. He didn't tell me he loved me. He knew I knew that. Instead, he fumbled with the hem of his gown and pressed something hard and cold into my palm. It was a small, brass skeleton key, heavy for its size and worn smooth by years of being tucked away. His fingers clamped over mine with a final, surprising surge of strength. His voice was a dry rattle, barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of a mountain. He told me to go to the cellar. Not the main basement where the laundry was, but the old root cellar behind the furnace, the one hidden behind the stack of empty paint cans. He told me there was a floor safe under the loose stone. He gave me a sequence of numbers, repeating them twice until he saw me nod. Then he pulled me even closer, his eyes boring into mine with an intensity that felt like a command. He told me that everything in that safe was for me and me alone. He told me that he had watched how they treated me, how they had spent my childhood looking at me as a burden while they looked at him as a bank. His final words weren't a blessing, they were a warning. He told me they would come for it all, and when they did, I was to show them no mercy because they had never shown any to him. I sat back, the key biting into my palm, watching him drift back into the fog of the morphine. The argument in the hallway was still going on. My mother was now talking about the value of the house's original crown molding. I looked at the key and then at the door, feeling a cold shiver of realization. I thought he was just rambling from the medication. The law office was located on the 42nd floor of a building made of glass and cold ambition. It was the kind of place where the carpets were thick enough to swallow the sound of a falling teardrop, though nobody in my family was shedding any. My parents had arrived early, looking like they were dressed for a victory parade rather than a legal proceeding. My father was wearing a charcoal suit that still had the crisp scent of a high-end department store on it, a suit I knew he couldn't afford on his dwindling salary. My mother had draped herself in silk and pearls, her chin tilted upward as she surveyed the mahogany-paneled room. They were radiating a smug, electric energy, whispering to each other about real estate listings in the suburbs as if the money was already sitting in their joint checking account. They didn't even look at me when I walked in. To them, I was just a ghost in the room, a witness to their impending coronation. Mr. Sterling, Grandpa's attorney, sat behind a desk that looked like it cost more than my first car. He was a man of few words and even fewer smiles. He adjusted his glasses and looked at my parents with a clinical sort of detachment. He asked if everyone was comfortable, and my mother let out a small, performative sigh, leaning forward with her hands clasped. She was ready to receive her prize. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of the lawyer sliding a heavy manila folder across the leather desk pad. He cleared his throat and began to read the preamble. My parents nodded along to the legalese, their eyes darting toward the section where the numbers would finally be revealed. When he reached the distribution of assets, the air in the room seemed to vanish. Mr. Sterling's voice didn't waver as he read the words that Grandpa had meticulously prepared. To my grandson, he read, I bequeath the entirety of my liquid assets, including the investment portfolios and the primary estate, totaling $3.5 million. I saw my father's posture straighten, a predatory grin forming on his lips before the sentence even finished. But then the lawyer continued. To my son and his wife, I bequeath the sum of $1 each, specifically for the purchase of a clue, as they have spent their lives without one. The silence that followed was deafening. It lasted for maybe 3 seconds before the explosion happened. My father's face went from a smug tan to a violent, bruised purple. He slammed his fist onto the mahogany desk, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the quiet office. My mother didn't just gasp, she let out a shrill, piercing shriek that sounded like metal scraping against glass. She stood up so fast her chair flipped backward onto the expensive carpet. The silk and pearls didn't look elegant anymore. They looked ridiculous as she began to pace the small room, her face contorted with a rage so pure it was almost unrecognizable. They started hurling accusations, claiming the lawyer had faked the documents, that I had drugged an old man, and that the entire firm was part of a conspiracy to rob them of their birthright. Mr. Sterling simply folded his hands and watched them, his expression never changing. He had seen this kind of greed before, but even he seemed taken aback by the sheer vitriol they directed at me. They called me a thief, a manipulator, and a parasite, all while demanding to know where the rest of the money was hidden. My mother didn't cry for her father, she screamed at the lawyer. But they hadn't even seen the note yet, the one that explained exactly why they were being erased. I sat in my apartment that night with the lights dimmed, the only glow coming from the harsh blue light of my laptop screen and the pale yellow beam of a desk lamp. The brass key Grandpa had given me sat on the desk, looking heavier than it had in the hospital. I needed to understand the why behind his anger. I knew my parents were greedy, but the sheer level of his exclusion felt like a surgical strike. I started digging into the digital archives of my own life, opening folders I hadn't touched in years and logging into old accounts that had long been dormant. I started with my college fund. I remembered being 17 and being told by my father, with a somber look on his face, that the market had taken a hit and most of my tuition savings had evaporated. At the time, I had felt guilty for even asking about it. I had spent 4 years working 2 jobs and taking out high-interest loans to make up the gap. As I pulled the historical statements, the truth started to leak out like oil from a broken engine. There was no market crash. There were just 3 massive withdrawals made in the summer of my senior year. One for $15,000, one for $10,000, and a final sweep of $8,000. The dates lined up perfectly with the month my parents suddenly decided to remodel their kitchen with granite countertops and high-end Italian appliances. They hadn't lost my future to the economy. They had traded my education for a kitchen island they barely used. My stomach cramped, a cold, hollow feeling spreading through my chest. I kept digging. I went back further, into the small trust my maternal grandmother had left me when she passed. It wasn't a fortune, maybe $20,000, meant to be a nest egg for my first home. The account had been emptied the day I turned 18, before I even knew the paperwork existed. My mother's signature was on the transfer form, a loopy, elegant script that looked like a mocking wave. I opened a spreadsheet and started a column titled The Theft. It wasn't just the big numbers that hurt, it was the realization that my entire childhood was a series of financial extractions. I remembered the paper route I had when I was 12. I had saved every penny in a ceramic pig bank, dreaming of buying a high-end mountain bike. One day, the pig was lighter. My mother told me she had moved the money to a high-yield savings account for my own good. Looking at their old joint statements now, I saw where that paper route money actually went. A series of weekend trips to a nearby casino and a wellness retreat my mother had insisted she needed for her stress. They had literally gambled away a 12-year-old's hard-earned tips. The deeper I went, the more the memories reframed themselves. Every time I was told we were struggling and I needed to forego a field trip or buy my clothes from the thrift store, they were actually sitting on a cushion of money they had siphoned from my future. I found a record of a $5,000 bond my grandpa had gifted me for my 10th birthday. He had told me then it was for my grand adventure. My father had cashed it out 6 months later to pay off a credit card bill he'd run up buying a boat he sold 2 seasons later at a loss. They treated my existence as a line of credit with a 0% interest rate and no repayment plan. I sat there for hours, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. I was cross-referencing dates of their financial crises with the dates of their luxury purchases. It was a perfect mirror image. Whenever I lost something, they gained something. It was a parasitic relationship masquerading as a family dynamic. They didn't see me as a son to be protected, they saw me as a resource to be mined. By the time the sun started to creep through the blinds, I had reached the end of the digital trail. I saw the final balances, the interest I would have earned, and the sheer volume of loans that were never mentioned again. I sat back, my eyes burning from the screen, and stared at the final sum at the bottom of the column. It was a number that represented a stolen decade of security and peace of mind. I totaled the numbers, and my breath hitched. They hadn't just been bad parents, they had been systematic thieves since I was 8 years old. The banging on my door started at 7 o'clock on a Tuesday evening. It wasn't the polite, rhythmic knock of a neighbor or a delivery driver. It was the frantic, heavy-handed thudding of people who believed they owned the space on the other side. I didn't need to look through the peephole to know who it was. The air in the hallway seemed to vibrate with their collective indignation. When I opened the door, my parents brushed past me without waiting for an invitation, radiating a sense of authority that was as unearned as it was suffocating. My mother was clutching a manila folder to her chest like it was a holy relic, and my father was already scanning my living room with a sneer, likely calculating the resale value of my furniture. They sat down on my sofa as if they were presiding over a high court. My mother pulled a stapled document from her folder and slid it across the coffee table toward me. It was titled Settlement Agreement and Mutual Release in a bold, clumsy font. I looked at the first page and felt a cold flash of ironical laughter bubble up in my throat. They were demanding a flat payment of $2 million. Below the figure was a bulleted list titled Reimbursement for Child Rearing Expenses. They had actually sat down and itemized 24 years of my existence. They had listed the cost of my diapers, the prorated share of the grocery bills from 1998 to 2012, the electricity I used to do my homework, and even the cost of the emotional labor my mother claimed she expended during my teenage years. My father leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his eyes narrowed in a way that used to make me flinch when I was 10. He told me that they were being generous. He said that Grandpa had clearly been suffering from late-stage dementia, that his mind had been a sieve of confusion and paranoia during his final months. He looked me dead in the eye and accused me of elder abuse. He said I had spent those long nights in the hospice room whispering lies into an old man's ear, poisoning his heart against his own children just to secure a payday. My mother joined in, her voice trembling with a rehearsed, theatrical tremor. She told me I was a manipulative monster who had preyed on a dying man's frailty. She said that the 3.5 million belonged to the family unit, not to a selfish child who had tricked his way into a will. The gaslighting was so thick I could almost taste it. They spoke with such conviction that for a split second, I wondered if I had imagined the lucidity in Grandpa's eyes. But then I felt the weight of the brass key in my pocket, and the memory of their hallway argument about the watches came flooding back. They weren't grieving, they were negotiating. They told me that if I signed the papers and handed over the $2 million, they would forgive me for my betrayal and keep the matter out of the courts. They talked about family loyalty as if it were a debt I owed them, while ignoring the fact that they had defaulted on every emotional obligation they had to me. I sat there in silence, letting the waves of their vitriol wash over me. I didn't defend myself. I didn't bring up the college fund they'd drained or the grandmother's inheritance they'd swallowed whole. I realized that you cannot reason with people who view you as an investment property rather than a human being. My mother started crying then, aloud, dry sobbing that was meant to provoke guilt, but all I felt was a profound sense of exhaustion. I looked at the itemized bill for my own childhood, a document that proved they had never seen me as anything other than a line item, and I realized the bridge wasn't just burned, it had been nuked. I stood up, walked to the front door, and held it wide open. I didn't argue. I just pointed to the door. But as they left, my father whispered a threat that made me realize this was no longer a family dispute, it was a war. The first notification chimed at 3 in the morning. Then another. By 5, my phone was a vibrating brick of digital vitriol that refused to stay quiet. I finally reached over, squinting against the glare, and saw my mother's profile picture staring back at me. She had posted a public gallery on every social media platform she owned. The lead image was a grainy, sepia-toned photo of her holding me in the hospital right after I was born, looking tired but triumphant. The caption was a masterpiece of manipulative fiction. She wrote about how they had sacrificed their dreams, their finances, and their youth to give me a life of luxury, only for me to turn around and rob them while they were paralyzed by the grief of losing their patriarch. She used words like elder financial abuse and psychological grooming. She claimed that I had barred them from the hospice room in Grandpa's final hours, a lie so bold it made my head spin, and that I was now laughing at their poverty from behind a pile of unearned millions. The comments section was a shark tank. Distant aunts I hadn't spoken to in a decade were chiming in to call me a cold-blooded sociopath. Cousins who had never even visited Grandpa in the hospital were suddenly experts on his mental state, claiming they had noticed his confusion months ago. My mother had tagged every extended family member, every old family friend, and even a few local community groups. She was playing the role of the broken, grieving daughter to perfection. By noon, the narrative had solidified. I was the greedy villain who had manipulated a dying man into cutting off his own children. My inbox became a landfill of hate speech. One uncle sent a 3-paragraph message telling me that if I had any shred of decency, I would sign over the estate and move to a different state so the family could heal from the shame I'd brought upon them. Another family friend, someone I used to trust, told me that money wouldn't buy me a soul once I'd sold mine to the devil. This is what people don't tell you about toxic families. They don't just want your money, they want your reputation. They want to make sure that if you don't share the spoils, you don't get to enjoy them. It's a scorched earth policy designed to isolate you until the only people you have left to turn to are the very people who are destroying you. I watched as people I had known my entire life liked and shared her post, adding their own anecdotes about how I was always a difficult child or how I never seemed grateful for what I had. They were all feeding on the drama, eager to participate in a public execution of my character without ever asking for my side of the story. My parents were the conductors of this digital orchestra, directing the flying monkeys to swoop down and peck at my sanity. I spent the afternoon watching the share count climb. Every time the number ticked up, I felt a piece of my old self, the part that still hoped for a peaceful resolution, wither and die. My mother even started a crowdfunding page, claiming they needed legal fees to fight for Grandpa's true wishes and to keep their home. It was a level of brazen entitlement that bordered on the psychotic. They were using my face and my history to fund a war against me. They posted photos of my childhood birthdays, framing every gift they'd ever given me as a debt that was now due with interest. The contrast between the loving mother in the photos and the woman currently orchestrating a character assassination was enough to give me whiplash. I realized then that they were counting on my silence. They were banking on the fact that I had always been the one to take the high road, the one who hated conflict, the one who would rather lose a limb than cause a scene. They thought I would crumble under the weight of the collective disapproval and hand over the keys to the kingdom just to make the noise stop. They didn't realize that Grandpa hadn't just left me money, he had left me his spine. He had spent his final years watching them do this to him, and he had prepared me for the moment they would turn their sights on me. My reputation was being shredded by the people who gave me life. It was time to stop being the quiet one and start being the one with the receipts. I drove to my grandfather's empty house at midnight, the silence of the neighborhood pressing against the car windows like a physical weight. The air inside the house was stale, smelling of dust and the lingering, sharp scent of the peppermint tea he used to drink. I bypassed the main living areas, not wanting to see the empty recliner or the dust outlines where my parents had already pilfered a few small statues and lamps. I headed straight for the cellar. Behind the furnace, shielded by a wall of rusted paint cans and old gardening tools, I found the loose stone he had described. It didn't look like much, just a jagged piece of slate, but when I pried it up, the floor safe sat there, cold and waiting. I entered the sequence of numbers he had whispered to me in the hospital, my heart hammering against my ribs. The heavy steel door clicked and swung open with a smooth, oiled silence that felt out of place in such a gritty corner of the world. Inside the safe, there were no gold bars or stacks of cash. Instead, there was a series of black, cloth-bound ledgers and a thick accordion file bursting with photocopies. I sat on the cold concrete floor, the dim overhead bulb casting long, flickering shadows as I opened the first volume. My grandfather had always been a meticulous man, a machinist by trade, someone who believed that if you measured twice, you only had to cut once. He had applied that same mechanical precision to tracking the betrayal of his own children. This wasn't just a diary, it was a forensic audit of my parents' greed. The entries started nearly 5 years ago, around the time his health first began to dip. The first few pages were heartbreaking. He had documented every loan my father had requested, usually under the guise of an emergency or a business opportunity that never materialized. Beside each entry, Grandpa had noted the actual truth. My father had asked for $5,000 for a medical procedure. For my mother, Grandpa had discovered the money was actually used to settle a gambling debt at a local casino. My mother had requested $10,000 for a charitable foundation she was starting. Grandpa had found the receipt for a designer wardrobe she had hidden in the back of her closet. He had been paying for their lifestyle for years, watching them treat him like a bottomless well while they waited for him to dry up so they could claim the bucket. But then the entries took a darker, more desperate turn. About 8 months before he passed, the handwriting in the ledger became cramped and angry. My parents had stopped asking and started scheming. I found a photocopy of a durable power of attorney document. It was mostly filled out in my mother's distinct, loopy handwriting, but the signature at the bottom was a shaky, pathetic imitation of my grandfather's script. Beneath the copy, Grandpa had written a single note: "They tried to sign my life away while I was napping in the sun. They didn't know I saw the ink on the desk." He had caught them trying to steal his legal agency while he was still fully capable of making his own decisions. He hadn't confronted them then, he had simply moved his assets, changed his locks, and started building this safe. The audit continued with a terrifying level of detail. He had recorded phone conversations where my father had tried to convince him that I, his own grandson, was asking for money behind his back. My father had told Grandpa that I was in trouble with the law and needed a secret bailout. Grandpa had called me that same night, acting like he just wanted to chat, confirming that I was fine and that my father was lying to him to get more cash. He wrote about the time my mother tried to swap his genuine Rolex for a high-end counterfeit she bought online, thinking he wouldn't notice the weight difference on his wrist. He noticed. He always noticed. He had kept the fake watch in a small velvet bag inside the safe as evidence of her attempt. As I flipped through the final ledger, I found a spreadsheet he had typed out and printed. It was a comprehensive list of every cent they had stolen or attempted to steal over the last decade. He had calculated the interest, the inflation, and the emotional tax he felt he had paid. The total was staggering. It wasn't just a few thousand here or there. They had effectively drained him of nearly $500,000 before he finally cut them off. He had even included photos he'd taken with a hidden camera in his office, grainy images of my mother rifling through his desk drawers, and my father trying to guess the combination to his wall safe upstairs. I sat there on the cellar floor for a long time, the cold of the concrete seeping into my bones. I felt a strange mix of crushing grief for the lonely war my grandfather had been fighting and a burning, righteous anger that cleared the last of the fog from my brain. My parents weren't just entitled, they were criminals who had spent years trying to ruin a man's peace in his final days. They were currently online telling the world I was the manipulator, while the evidence in my lap proved they were the architects of their own exile. Grandpa hadn't left me this money to make my life easy. He had left it to me as a weapon, knowing I was the only one with the stomach to finally use it. The numbers didn't lie, and neither did Grandpa's handwriting. He hadn't just left me money, he had left me a roadmap to their crimes. I was sitting in the glass-walled conference room of my office, a space usually reserved for quarterly reviews and high-stakes strategy meetings, when I saw the man in the rumpled tan blazer pacing near the reception desk. He didn't have the look of a client or a vendor. He had the hungry, nervous energy of someone who got paid to ruin people's Tuesdays. My parents hadn't just filed the lawsuit, they had choreographed the delivery for maximum professional damage. They wanted me to be served in front of my boss, my colleagues, and my juniors. They wanted the entire office to whisper about how the rising star in the firm was actually a predatory grandson who had been sued for undue influence. It was a calculated attempt to break my spirit by threatening my livelihood, a classic move from their playbook of public shaming. The receptionist looked uncomfortable as the man approached her, his voice loud enough to carry across the open floor plan. He was asking for me by my full legal name, brandishing a thick envelope as if it were a weapon. I didn't hide. I didn't duck into the break room or slip out the back exit. I stood up, straightened my tie, and walked toward the lobby with a calm that I didn't entirely feel, but one that I had practiced in front of the mirror for 3 nights. Behind me, I could feel the eyes of my coworkers burning into my back. This was the moment my parents had been waiting for, the moment I was supposed to crumble and call them, sobbing, begging for a settlement just to make the embarrassment stop. I met the process server halfway. He started his rehearsed speech, his voice booming with that staged authority, but I cut him off before he could finish. I reached out, took the envelope with a steady hand, and looked him directly in the eye. I thanked him for his time and handed him a business card for my own attorney, Mr. Sterling's partner, a man whose hourly rate was more than my father's monthly mortgage payment. But I didn't stop there. Standing just a few feet away, leaning against the coffee station, was a man in a dark navy suit who looked like a retired detective because he was one. This was Marcus, the private investigator I had hired the morning after I found the ledgers in the cellar. As the process server turned to leave, Marcus stepped forward and handed the server a second envelope. He told the server, with a voice as dry as wood ash, that since he was already heading back to the city, he might as well deliver the countersuit and the subpoenas to my parents. I watched the confusion flicker across the server's face as he realized the hunter had just become the hunted. My parents were suing me for influence, but I was suing them for defamation, fraud, and the recovery of the stolen childhood funds I had documented in the audit. I was also subpoenaing 10 years of their financial records, every credit card statement, and every gambling log from the casinos my father frequented. The office was dead silent. The humiliation my parents had intended for me had backfired instantly. My boss, who had been watching from his doorway, didn't look at me with disgust. He looked at me with a strange kind of respect for how I was handling the ambush. I walked back to my desk, the heavy legal documents in my hand feeling like a shield rather than a burden. My parents thought this move would force my hand. They thought that dragging my name through the dirt of a public courtroom would make me fold and hand over the $2 million they felt entitled to. They were still playing a checkers game in a world that had moved on to high-stakes chess. They thought the lawsuit would scare me into a settlement. They didn't realize that in discovery, I'd be able to look into their bank accounts, too. The deposition room felt like a pressure cooker. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a low-frequency buzz that grated on my nerves. My parents sat across the table, my father tugging at his collar and my mother clutching a damp tissue, still trying to project the image of the grieving, wronged daughter. They thought their presence would intimidate the witnesses. They were wrong. Mr. Sterling sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of professional boredom as he called the first witness, Sarah, the hospice nurse who had been with Grandpa for his final 4 months. Sarah was a small woman with kind eyes and a spine made of tempered steel. She didn't look at my parents once as she took her oath. Mr. Sterling started with the basics, but quickly moved into the nature of my parents' visits. Sarah's testimony was devastating. She didn't describe them as visits, she described them as interrogations. She spoke about how my father would wait until the sedative was administered to lean over Grandpa's bed, demanding to know where he kept the physical titles to his properties. She recalled multiple instances where she had to ask my mother to leave the room because she was shouting at a sleeping man about his funeral expenses and why he hadn't updated his life insurance beneficiary list in a decade. Sarah's voice remained steady as she detailed the physical and emotional toll their presence took on Grandpa, noting that his heart rate would spike whenever they entered the room and only settle when I arrived to sit with him. The room went ice cold when Sarah reached the incident from the 3rd week of October. She described walking into the room during the graveyard shift and finding my mother standing over Grandpa's bed. My mother hadn't been holding his hand or praying. She had been using a bottle of dish soap she'd smuggled in to try and slide the gold signet ring and the heavy wedding band off Grandpa's swollen fingers while he was in a morphine-induced sleep. Sarah testified that when she confronted her, my mother didn't apologize or act embarrassed. She simply looked up and said that the rings were family heirlooms and she didn't want the funeral home staff to steal them. Sarah had reported the incident to her supervisor and documented it in the medical log, a copy of which was now being entered into evidence. My mother's face went a sickly shade of gray. She tried to scoff, to whisper something to her lawyer about Sarah being a liar, but the medical logs were right there on the table. Then came the testimony from Mr. Sterling's senior partner, who had handled Grandpa's affairs for 30 years. He confirmed that Grandpa had approached him nearly 2 years ago to specifically discuss how to disinherit his children without leaving a loophole for them to exploit. He testified that Grandpa was not only of sound mind, but was more focused and determined during those meetings than he had been in years. The lawyer described my parents not as heirs, but as a liability that Grandpa felt a moral obligation to mitigate before he passed. By the time the witnesses were finished, the atmosphere in the room had shifted entirely. My parents' legal team was whispering frantically, their posture slumped, looking like they wanted to be anywhere else. The weight of the objective truth was crushing the life out of their fabricated narrative of elder abuse and manipulation. They were no longer the victims of a greedy son, they were the perpetrators of a failed heist. Even the court reporter looked disgusted. The facade was crumbling, but my parents had one last, desperate card to play. The mediation room was smaller than the deposition hall, designed to feel intimate, almost cozy, as if the wood paneling and soft lighting could coax a sense of shared humanity out of a family that had spent months trying to destroy each other. My parents were still clinging to their delusions. My father sat with his arms crossed, a defiant scowl etched into his face, while my mother kept dabbing at her eyes, playing for a sympathy that no longer existed in that room. Their lawyer, a man who looked like he was starting to regret his retainer, cleared his throat and suggested that perhaps a 50-50 split would be the most dignified way to end this tragedy. He spoke of family unity and the high cost of a trial, as if he were trying to save me from myself. I let him finish, watching the clock on the wall tick forward with a rhythmic, mechanical finality. I didn't offer a counter-settlement. I didn't even look at the spreadsheets or the documents spread across the table. Instead, I pulled a small, silver thumb drive from my pocket and set it in the center of the mahogany surface. I told the room that my grandfather was a man who understood the value of a backup plan. He knew that a handwritten note could be contested, that a signature could be called a forgery, and that a lawyer's testimony could be framed as bias. He knew his children better than they knew themselves, and because of that, he had left one final piece of discovery that would end any debate about his intent or his mental state. I signaled to Mr. Sterling, who pulled a laptop forward and plugged in the drive. The screen flickered to life, showing the interior of Grandpa's study, the sun streaming in through the window behind his desk. He was sitting in his favorite leather chair, wearing the cardigan I had bought him for Christmas 2 years ago. He looked tired, yes, but his eyes were as clear as mountain water. He looked directly into the lens with a piercing, steady gaze that seemed to reach across the grave and grab everyone in that room by the throat. There was no confusion in his expression, no fog of dementia. There was only the cold, hard clarity of a man who had seen too much and decided he'd had enough. "Hello, Robert." "Hello, Diane," my grandfather said, his voice resonant and steady, lacking any of the tremors he'd had in the hospital. "If you're watching this, it means you've done exactly what I knew you'd do. It means you've chosen greed over grief and a lawsuit over a legacy." He paused, leaning forward, his hands folded neatly on the desk. "I am making this recording to state, for the record and for any court that cares to listen, that I am in full possession of my faculties. I am making these decisions because I have spent the last decade watching you treat me like an ATM and treating my grandson like a nuisance. I have watched you steal from his future and lie to my face while you waited for me to die so you could pick my bones clean." The color drained from my father's face as Grandpa began to list the very same incidents I had found in the ledgers. He spoke about the forged power of attorney, the stolen watches, and the lies they had told about me to try and turn him against me. He spoke with a quiet, devastating disappointment that was far more painful to witness than anger would have been. He looked at the camera and said that he had intentionally left them $1 each so they couldn't claim he had simply forgotten them. He wanted it known that the exclusion was deliberate, earned, and final. He finished by saying that every penny was to go to me because I was the only person in the family who had ever offered him a hand without reaching for his wallet. His final words were a stone-cold command: "You are never to receive a single dime of my labor. Do not harass the boy. Do not look for more. You have already taken enough." The video cut to black, leaving the reflection of my parents' stunned, pale faces on the laptop screen. For the first time in my life, I saw them truly silenced. The layers of gaslighting, the false narratives, and the theatrical outrage had been stripped away by the voice of the man they had spent years trying to manipulate. There was no defense against the truth when it came directly from the source. Their lawyer didn't even wait for the mediator to speak. He looked at my father, then at the laptop, and slowly began sliding his files back into his leather briefcase. He didn't say a word to his clients. He just stood up, adjusted his jacket, and walked toward the exit. The room went silent as my grandfather's voice filled the air. My parents' lawyer literally packed his bags and walked out. It was over. The legal battle didn't end with a bang so much as a pathetic, whimpering slide into irrelevance. Once the video evidence was entered into the official record, my parents' case collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane. They tried to slink back into the shadows, but the damage was done. The social media campaign they had launched to destroy me backfired with a vengeance. The same distant relatives and flying monkeys who had been screaming for my head suddenly went silent, or worse, turned their judgment on my parents. In a small town, word travels fast, and the label of elder abuser is a stain that doesn't scrub off. They were left with the massive legal fees for a shark lawyer who had abandoned them, the mountain of debt they had accumulated while betting on an inheritance that never came, and a house that felt a lot emptier now that the rest of the family treated them like pariahs. I didn't keep all the money for myself. I knew that wasn't what Grandpa would have wanted, and it certainly wasn't what I needed to heal. I took a significant portion of the $3.5 million and established the Arthur Miller Legacy Foundation. It's a scholarship and support fund specifically designed for young adults trying to escape toxic, financially abusive family structures. We provide the gap funding for tuition, the security deposits for first apartments, and the legal resources I wish I had known about when I was 18 and watching my college fund disappear. Every time I sign a check for a student who finally has a chance to breathe, I feel Grandpa's hand on my shoulder. It's the ultimate vindication, turning their greed into a ladder for people just like me. I moved to a new city, bought a modest place with a workshop in the back, and blocked every single one of their numbers. The silence is the best thing money ever bought me. I spend my weekends working with cedar planks, just like he taught me, the smell of the wood shavings bringing back the only memories of him that actually matter. I still have the note. Sometimes I read it just to remind myself that someone saw the truth. And speaking of truth, You won't believe what happened when my brother tried to call me last week.